Hi friends. So I want to share with you something that I think is really important to reading, and it's something that I try to do when I'm reading for other people, but that I rarely do when I'm doing a reading myself, for myself. And I realized this morning that I was doing it, and I thought, oh, why don't I make a video talking about it? So I did this reading for myself, and what I want to talk about is the idea of like settling for somewhat vague answers when you do a reading for yourself or for anyone. So I'm going to sort of talk through specificity and just trying to dig deeper to really get the answer that is a practical answer. It's a useful answer to the question. I talk about this a lot, and I talk about it in my book, but sometimes you sort of look at the cards and you say, okay, this means this and this means this, and here's what I do. But it can get a little vague sometimes, and vague can be fine in some cases, and sometimes it's just not helpful. You know what I mean? What does it really mean? What are we really after? What are we really saying? So here's a poll that I did for myself this morning on the question, what can I do to make the most out of today? It wasn't, it was just I had some time in the morning, and I drew some cards because they were sitting on the table in front of me, and immediately found myself doing this sort of thing that I do, which is a bad habit in my book. Let me just move some stuff out of the way. I probably should have cleaned. But look at this. I managed to get a first edition of The Wild Unknown, which is something I've always wanted, and it's out, and I'm just loving it because I love those backs. Anyway, that's not what this is about. This is what this is about. This, if you're curious, is the Tarot de Marseille Edition Millennium, a deck I picked up at the Reader's Studio because I don't have enough Marseille decks. All right, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about not settling. We're talking about digging deeper to get the real answer we're after. It doesn't matter what kind of cards you're using for this, and I think it's the same regardless. So again, the question I asked when I drew was, what can I do to get the most out of today? And of course I got the Six of Swords, Force, and the Pope. Now, here's where I go, right? So whenever I do a reading, I just sort of scan the cards to see if anything's really jumping out. I'm always looking for flow, and right now I see that the Force and the Pope both looking to the right. So, theoretically both looking towards the future. So I could stop there and say, just be really, thoughtful about where you're going. But of course, there's more to reading than that, right? But always an interesting thing to look at the direction where people are looking. In this case, Force is looking at the Pope. So there's something there about sort of strength or force or will or effort looking towards faith or tradition. So I'm always scanning for that. I'm thinking about the first card, which is a swords card. So I'm thinking about that as maybe setting the tone. So what's my theme? It's going to be thinking, communicating, writing, learning, all things that are associated with swords for me. And then now I'm going to do the math of the reading, right? Now, if you're reading a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, you're going to do the math of the image or the math of the Golden Dawn associations. If you're doing a pip reading, you're going to think about however you interpret your pips. In my case, it's generally suit and number. So 6 for me is, it's about beauty. It's about vanity in some cases. It's about rebalancing after struggle, right? Because 5 is disruption, 6 rebalances, restores after disruption. It's also 3 and 3, which is double growth, if you think about it. So 3 is growth, expansion, the birth of something. 6 doubles that, and so it sort of takes it to a new level. So I do all of this stuff in my mind, and then I try to weave it into an answer. What I really want to focus on, though, just to start, because this is really where I realized what I was doing, and I decided to make this video, so I actually stopped. So whenever I have an even swords card, I'm often thinking about a split in the mind, right? I'm thinking about being of two minds about something, or being indecisive about something, or being decisive about something. In this case, I was thinking about balance. 6 is a very balanced card in many ways, and all the evens are balanced. I can't remember whether I can't remember. I view and read so much, but someone said recently, I can't remember if it was Kelly or if it was Caitlin Matthews in her book, but the odd numbers disrupt and the even numbers restore, or something like that. So I said, okay, great. I need to rebalance my mind. And that was my interpretation for the 6 of Swords, and then I went on to start thinking about these two. And then I paused, and I said, would I be satisfied with that answer if I were a client? And I wouldn't be, because what does that mean, rebalance the mind? And right there is sort of the key to the video, to this particular conversation, because what does that mean, rebalance the mind? It's like, it sounds like it's specific. It sounds like something like, oh yeah, just rebalance your mind. Well, how? How do you rebalance your mind? And that's, to me, where a lot of readings that I do for myself, a lot of readings I've gotten over the years, I don't actually let people read for me much anymore unless I know them. You know what I mean? Like, the people I've let read for me over the years, a very small number, because I've had a lot of bad readings in my early years of learning. But I think where a lot of readings fall down is we come up with an answer like, balance your mind. Great, cool. And the client says, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then we go off and we're like, what does that mean? What do I do? How do I balance my mind? So where I'm getting at is, like, I am letting myself off the hook as a reader, and I'm not getting what I need as a client by saying something that, though it sounds doable, is really tough. It's easier said than done. Right? And now I can, there are a couple ways to handle this situation, right? I can say to a client, okay, this card's really about balancing your mind right now. You've been thinking a lot, spent a lot of disruptive thought, you need to rebalance. And if they're in front of me, I can have a conversation with them and say, what does that look like for you? What do you think that means? And really engage them. And a lot of readings that happen face-to-face wind up just being telling, or they could be more of a conversation. But there's no reason not to engage a client if they're sitting in front of you. Now, most of my readings that I do, almost all of them, are done on video. Even when I'm reading for friends, I actually prefer to do them on video so that they can go back and reference them later as they go through the experience. And a lot of people I read for do that, and they'll come back and say, oh, a few months ago you said this, and that happened, or this other thing happened, and like, can we revisit? And we do. And I think that's a really productive way to engage reading, especially if you're going to have a series of readings. But if I'm doing a video reading, or if I'm doing a written reading, the person's not there for me to engage in a conversation with. So what I need to do as a reader is I need to engage that and go deeper. Now, I do have other cards to provide context, right? But even there, if I start with something nebulous, if I start with something vague, I tend to continue with a vague reading. Now, part of the problem, I would say, is my question. And here's another thing I get lazy about, and I talk about this in a lot of my videos as well. I think my question is somewhat lazy. What do I need to do to get the most out of today? And it's fine. You know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with the question, but it's not super specific, and so the answer I'm going to get is going to be kind of vague anyway. So I'm sort of going in with vagueness. What would be a better question? I think it depends on what I'm really after. A day is a long time, and a lot of things happen. What can I do to make the most out of today if it's just sort of a regular day? It's a vague question. What am I expecting to get out of the day? What am I hoping to have happen? A lot of those things will affect what I view as making the most out of something. And a lot of times where I think, as we're beginning to read, if we ask a question like that, we do a reading, we ask our vague question, we get our vague answer, we go back at the end of the day and we say, what the fuck? That doesn't make any sense. And I think it's because we weren't specific enough. So, a better question I could have asked was, what can I do to get the most out of my workday? What can I do to make today as productive as possible creatively, professionally? What can I do to make the most out of my time with the company I'm having tonight? The more specific, I think, the better. Just again, because it's easier to measure our progress. So I would say that my question was fine. It's not great. But working with the question, which is what I asked, and the cards drawn answer the question asked, by having a vaguer question, it means I have to do a little more work on this end of the interpretation. So I would say what I need to do before I accept balance the mind, or rebalance your thoughts, or rebalance, is to dig a little bit deeper into that, into the concept of rebalancing the mind and what's going on in my life, before I even move on to the other three and come up with my answer. Like, what does rebalance my mind really mean in terms of my day, in what's going on right now? What does that look like, and how might I go about doing it? Again, these cards might help me answer that question, but I really want to just focus on the sort of vagueness that I started with, and see if I can mine it for anything that resonates and is practical. So, what I know about swords, I mentioned earlier, swords are about learning, they're about communicating, writing and speaking, they're about thinking. What else do I know about swords? They cut. They are weapons, you know what I mean? So I want to sort of like think about everything I know about swords, and then everything I know about six. Six rebalances after discord. Six is beauty. Six is vanity. Six is 3 plus 3, so it's growth plus growth. So what's going on in my life right now? Well, things have been sort of boring on the job. I finished my thesis, so all of my grad school work is done. I'm feeling sort of restless. I'm feeling sort of bored in general. You know, a lot, and a lot of life right now is feeling just sort of restless for me because, you know, we're in a slow period at work, and having finished grad school, I'm now suddenly not spinning my wheels. Like, I was really working like crazy over the summer. Now, that's sparking, and this is literally just happening as I think about it. Now, that's sparking for me an interesting thing. Everything I just described, which was a really busy summer. I had class, I was working full-time, going to school full-time, writing, working on my thesis, getting all of this stuff done. And that's a very 5 experience, right? Here we have a 6, that's a very 5 experience. So I've actually moved from 5 to 6 now. You know, stability after a storm, rebalance after disruption. So it's a very disruptive summer, not in a bad way, in a good way. And so now I'm starting to think of this 6 as kind of a negative thing. Now I'm looking at this 6 in terms of shadow, because it is representing the calm after the storm, but the storm was good and the calm is kind of dull. So, that's clicking with me now in a way. I'm like, okay, yeah, and I'd never thought about it that way. I've never thought about the 6 of Swords in context of that way. 6 after, you know, and swords are learning, right? So I'm done with school, I'm done with my thesis. I've had a real injection of learning this summer, and now that part's over, and I'm rebalancing after that. You know, and that is boring, but it also feels like important. And now I start to look at the image of these little things growing, you know, these little flowers and this larger flower sort of trapped in the middle. And it makes me think about the way you can't over-mother a plant. You can't over-indulge a plant or it dies. And so I think where this 6 now is like rebalancing the mind, it's much more complex than that. It's like you have to live in this space of rebalance because you have gone through such a disruptive, again, not a bad experience, but a disruptive experience with all this learning. And if you really want to get the most out of that, you kind of just need to let things settle. You know, you need to let the seeds grow in the earth, let them plant, let your mind absorb all of these things that you've had to absorb so that you can truly start to understand them. And that's been something I haven't really wanted to do. I miss class. I miss doing all the work for my thesis. I enjoy that stuff. But you do, you know, learning is like making bread. You've got to let the dough rise. And so this is saying to me, one of the things you can do to get the most out of today is start practicing the concept of letting the dough rise, of resting after a really disruptive period where your instinct is to want to go back. In order to actually move forward in life, you've got to sort of remind yourself it's time to not have disruption. It's time to just sit with what you've learned and sit with what you've gone through and let that percolate. And you come to a disruptive moment in the 7 again, where you go back and look at what you've learned a little bit more objectively. Because 7's for me about a re-internalizing of something, or an internalizing after. So in that sequence of 5, 6, 7, you have a disruption. In the 6, so in 5 you have a disruption. In the 6 you rest after the disruption, and in the 7 you go back and say, what do I learn? What have I learned? What do I know now that I didn't know before? And so to really make the most of anything, you have to let it proof, you have to let it internalize. And so in terms of the learning I've done, in terms of my education, it's time for me to really just sort of let those things percolate. And now, actually, that takes me really easily into force, rather than trying to force these cards together. Let me just call strength, and there's a force strength in this case, so it doesn't get. Rather than forcing strength into a meaning, I get instantly, just the image alone, a sense of you're going to have an urge to force things, to disrupt and to push, but that's not, you're going to have to be gentle with it. If we think about what we know about strength to me is frequently about encouragement of something, of using will rather than force, of using mind over might, so to speak. An internal strength of approaching things gently. And as I look at the image, I see both of these as different sides of myself. And I'm a Leo, so the lion is always an interesting thing when it comes up. And just sort of gently reminding yourself to do this, you know what I mean? So you're going to feel like you have to force it, but you don't. You just have to sort of, when you're supposed to be doing something, when you're supposed to be in this restive state, it can be difficult. You feel like you have to force yourself to do it. But you have to be gentle with yourself. You have to allow yourself to recognize the fact that you're not going to feel that way all the time. You're going to be a little bit and so you say, it's okay. You know what I mean? My therapist always tells me, it's it's okay to feel what you're feeling. So you don't force yourself. Force is such an interesting name for this card. Because for me, it's actually, in a lot of ways, it's the opposite of what we think force means. It's not pushing. It's exerting gentleness. It's achieving something without force. And if I think back to the beginning of this is actually my year card. So it ties in, it's a really good lesson for me, because what I talked about in my year card, when I did that reading for myself, was that, well, it's not a reading, right? You calculate it, but this year is about not pushing it. It's about achieving things with will and not, exerting all your strength to do something. So when you start to feel like you're doing something bad by doing this, you gently remind yourself not, and then you go into the Pope and you have faith that you're going to keep moving forward. The Pope is looking forward. So the Pope for me here is about faith. And also just history and tradition, you're going to move forward. So don't push it, ultimately. Enjoy this moment where you're not ingesting all this stuff, where your mind isn't constantly racing and trying to think of all these things you have to do. Don't force it, enjoy it, because history tells you that you're going to move forward regardless. So just have faith in that, because tradition, which the Pope can also be, tells you you're always going to. So just have this moment so that you truly can do it, and just have faith that it's going to get there. You know what I mean? And so then that becomes a mantra for the day, and those are things I can actually do. I can actually be gentle with myself when I start to feel like I'm not doing enough, I'm not getting there, I'm not pushing, I'm not working. No, it's okay. You know what I mean? You get to rest, you get to let that stuff internalize. And so that to me is a much deeper, more practical, more useful thing than what I initially said was you have to rebalance your mind and you have to force yourself to whatever. You know what I mean? When we allow ourselves to sit with it, we allow ourselves to dig and really mine the cards and the context and the questions, oftentimes it will unlock something. And this to me is, it's not rocket science. We all have these life experiences that have taught us things. Likely, if you were to sit with these cards, and even if you ask the same question, your life context would be different. You maybe didn't finish school, and you're not sitting in the middle of a really boring series of weeks. So your wrestling with it is going to be different. But we engage it, and we sit with it, and we dig, and we don't accept just the first thing that comes to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is the impulse, and I say I need to balance my mind. Well, dig deeper, and that's how I come up with what I just came up with. And really everything I've done in this reading I did that way. You know what I mean? I really stopped this morning when I said that, and I haven't thought about it since, other than like, it's time to sit down and do this reading. And I tried to remember what I was saying to myself with the Six of Swords. And this is one reason why I would also say writing a reading for yourself, or doing it out loud, or making a vlog, for example, those are really useful ways, because it's easier to let yourself off the hook when you just draw cards and you look at them and say, yep, and then you sweep them away. You know, when you're doing something like this, where you really have to sit with it, that's a really, it's a really encouraging thing, and it makes you push it further, and I think that really helps. So this is all just a way of exploring how the first thing that comes to mind is good. And I do think we should work with that. I think it's good to explore that, but like, that's the surface level. If we get our shovel and we just keep digging, eventually we find gold. And it unlocks something in the reading, and then the context of the reading comes to life. So I know something about today that, even if my question was a little bit vague, is good, you know what I mean? And I wouldn't have gotten it if I had just said balance your mind. I would have said, okay, yep, know what that means, swept it up and gone on with my day. But now I know that I really need to work with myself gently, to have faith that this rebalancing is necessary, and that it's okay to experience it, and it's okay to rest, and that the work will come, and I'll start being mentally excited again. But in the meantime, I just need to let all of that stuff grow and percolate and, flourish. So anyway, I hope this helps. I like sharing the stuff, and I like sharing my bad habits, because I think it's a good way to go, and also is a nice reminder to me and everybody that I am frequently a bad habit, a victim of my own bad habits. So anyway, hope you have a good weekend, and we'll talk soon.